What's up guys, it's Brad from Light Architect here. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can create this cool truck explosion utilizing the KHAOS add-on inside of Blender 3D. While I will not be covering any mesh deformation, I will be showing you how you can create this cool interactive explosion as well as the addition of our glass debris field utilizing some KHAOS operators. Anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. As you can see, this is our default scene here, and as always the first thing we are going to do is delete everything in our scene. Then we'll go to the camera tab here and we'll just switch our render engine to cycles. And we're going to be using a 3D truck model from BlendSwap from Computer Geek Man here. It's a 1985 Ford Bronco. You can pretty much use any 3D model that you want. All the concepts still apply, but this is just to give him some credit here, so be sure to check him out on BlendSwap. Alright, so to append this 3D model, of course, we'll just go to File, Append, and we'll just go to wherever we saved our 3D file. So I have it under recent downloads, and we'll click it, and I think under object we can just select everything in the object tab here and then press append. And now as you can see, we have our truck in the middle of our scene, and we have a few unwanted objects here as well, so let's go ahead and delete them. We have these two lights as well as a camera here, so we'll just delete everything. And for the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to be using a very simple mesh of our truck here, so we'll just go ahead and delete some of these windows here just so we can deal with it more effectively. We could either bring them off to the side, or I'm just going to go ahead and delete them entirely. And now as you can see here, we have a pretty nice looking truck, and what we're going to do is we're going to make this truck interact with all of our fuel particles as well as our glass debris field. So let's go ahead and go to wireframe, and we'll go ahead and select it. And we're going to go ahead and just combine everything together so that it's just one object. So we'll just go to object and join, and now all the truck is just one piece here, and we'll just go ahead and change the name of this piece to truck. And now let's get started in creating our explosion inside of this truck. Alright, so first we want to make sure that Blender knows that we want the smoke and particle systems to interact with this truck here. So while our truck is selected, we'll just go to the physics tab here, and we'll go ahead and click on the collision button here. And this is going to make sure that any of the particles or glass debris fields that we add to our scene are interacting with the geometry of our truck here. We'll go ahead and bring the damping of our truck up to something like 0.5, just so we don't get any particles bouncing around in a really weird way. So we'll go ahead and just bring that up, and we'll leave everything else at its default. Then we'll go ahead and we'll also select the fluid button here, and we'll just change this type to effector and leave it as a collision effector. And what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that any of the smoke or fire in the scene is going to be interacting with the geometry of the truck as well. So the collision physics property is going to make sure that all of our particles and debris interacts with the truck, and the fluid property is going to make sure that any of the smoke or fire interacts with the truck. Alright, so now let's create our explosion inside of our truck here. And there are a lot of different ways we could create an explosion around this truck. We could simply just use an omnidirectional burst and put it inside of our truck here and let it blast out every which way out of the windows, and that could be pretty effective. But we want a little bit more of a customizable explosion result, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the directional burst operator here and then just add a bunch of them to our scene, having them blast out each window in a more random way. I kind of think of these different operators as different ways to model your explosion. Just like you would model a 3D object, you're going to use these different kinds of operators to model the base mesh and the base particle system of your explosion. So we'll go ahead and click on the dynamic smoke fire smoke type here, and we'll go ahead and choose a frame where we want our explosion to start. Maybe we'll go around frame 30, so we'll go ahead and select that on the timeline. Then we'll go ahead and select our 3D cursor here, and we'll click near the middle of our truck here, and that's going to be where our explosion is added to our scene. So we'll just click there, and then we'll just go ahead and go down to our KHAOS particle parameters here. So we'll leave most of our particle parameters at their presets here, but of course you can feel free to adjust them depending on what you'd like for your simulation. And we'll just go up here to directional burst and go ahead and click that. And now as you can see here, we have a directional burst added to our scene here as well as our custom domain cube. And we'll go ahead and just reposition our domain cube around our car a little bit better here, just where we want our explosion to be, and just kind of put it up here at the bottom of the car, and something like that should be pretty good. And now we'll go ahead and adjust our directional burst here. So we'll go ahead and select it, and we'll just put it inside, and we'll just make this first one blast out our back window here. So we'll just go ahead and scroll through it, see what it's doing so far. And actually it's not bad just as it is. I'm going to go to the particle tab here and adjust a few of the settings. I like to adjust my settings with the particles viewed as a cross, so I can get a little bit better idea of how the particles are interacting with each other. So I'll go to the viewport display here, and we'll change this to cross. And now we can kind of see what our particles are doing a little bit better for this kind of highly detailed simulation. So we'll just kind of scroll through it here, see what's happening. This is looking pretty good. We just want to kind of create some fuel blasting out each of the windows here and give it some kind of unique look. But I will adjust a few settings here. We'll go to our particle tab. I'll increase the number of fuel particles to something like, we'll try something like 650 and try it out again. That's looking pretty cool. And as you can see, since we've made our truck a collision object, all of our particles are interacting and bouncing around inside of the truck, which is going to create a much more organic looking particle blast. And this is looking pretty good. So I'll go ahead and add our second fuel field. We'll just go ahead and go back to frame 30 again, and we will add another directional burst. And this one will put blasting out the front window. So we'll just go ahead and move this one blasting out like this. We'll adjust a few of its settings to make it a little bit different than our first one. So maybe we'll make the number something like 860. See how that looks. And again, we'll also go back and change the display mode to cross. See what we're doing here. And I'll go ahead, I'll just kind of rotate this one down a little bit so it's blasting not quite as much upwards. Something like that is kind of cool. We might also decrease the lifetime of this one just to give it a little bit more variation in our different particle systems. Maybe we'll change this one to 3. And another thing you can do if you're not liking the scale of where your particles are blasting out, you could just select everything in your scene here, and then you could scale it up or down depending on if you want to make the relative size of your particle fields smaller or bigger. So for example, if we brought this down in size, when we go through the particle system, the particle fields are now in relative comparison much bigger than the actual truck itself. But I kind of like where we had it before, so we'll go ahead and undo that. And I think if we just had the particles just blasting out just past the end of the truck here, it should be pretty good. If anything, we could even just scale everything up a little bit so it doesn't blast out quite as much. Alright, so now essentially at this point it's just a matter of adding some more particle systems. So we'll go ahead and go back to frame 30. We'll add 2 more particle systems, one blasting out each side of the truck here. So we'll go ahead and add another directional burst, and we'll put this one kind of blasting out one side here. Kind of bring it up a little bit, rotate it over, and it kind of totally depends on what you're going for. That looks pretty good. We might increase the number to 1200 just to give it a little bit more variety, kind of create some variation in different particle systems. This is looking pretty cool. And you can also even increase the size of the particle system as well. So for example, we can increase the size of this one on the x-axis so that it blasts out both windows. And that looks pretty cool. And we'll go ahead and decrease the lifetime of this one to 3 as well. And essentially when it comes to particle lifetimes, the shorter the particle lifetime, the more smaller scale the explosion is going to look. So for example, if we were to create a nuclear explosion, we would want a much longer particle lifetime, as the scale of that is much bigger. But since on the relative scale of things, this is a smaller car explosion, we're going to use a shorter particle lifetime. So let's try this one out again. That's looking pretty cool. And again, we'll change the display mode to cross. And now we'll add one more particle system blasting out this right window here. So we'll go back to frame 30, add one more, and we'll put this one blasting out here. We might scale it up a little bit on the x-axis as well, just so we get both these windows covered. Something like that could be pretty cool. And we'll just change the display mode again to cross and increase the number of particles. We'll try something like 700 maybe. And maybe we'll increase the lifetime randomness a bit, give it a little more variation. And maybe we'll decrease the lifetime to, we'll try lifetime maybe 3. And actually we might bring that back to something. We'll try something like 5. Bring it back to 4 actually. And what we can do actually to give this simulation a little bit more variation, as you can see, this would probably work pretty well. We have fuel particles blasting out pretty much every window, kind of bouncing around the whole truck on the inside here. But to get an even more organic looking result, we might add some kind of secondary explosions. So what we could do is we could maybe go to frame 33 here instead of frame 30, and we'll go ahead and maybe add another directional burst and give it maybe a longer particle lifetime, something like 5, and maybe we'll do like 1250 particles. Again, we'll change the display mode to cross. Maybe we'll put this one blasting out the front window, and this will be kind of a secondary blast after that initial one. Give it a little more randomness maybe. Maybe we'll put it in the far back of the truck so it has a little bit more space to bounce around before it comes out the window. And as you can see, we have kind of a secondary blast coming out here, which is kind of cool. We'll bring the lifetime randomness down to 5, just so the particles are a little closer together. And then maybe we'll just go to velocity here, and we'll increase the randomize to something like 30. And now when we go through it, we have a lot more randomness here, because the more you crank up the random velocity, the more the particles are going to bounce around here. So let's go ahead and try it one more time. I think this will look pretty cool. We might decrease the particle lifetime to 4. That's looking pretty cool. We might just add one more secondary blast here, maybe around frame 34. Add another directional burst. Put this one at the front and put it a little bit higher, blasting straight out. Put the particles at like 650. Let's see what this one does. That's kind of cool. It's kind of blasting out the back window here. Again, we'll change the render display mode to cross, see what we're getting. Alright, so this is looking pretty cool. I think the particles are blasting a little bit too far away from our truck here. So again, what we can do to change that very quickly is we can just select everything, make sure everything is selected, and we'll just scale everything up a little bit so that essentially the relative size between our particle system and our truck is smaller. So we'll go ahead and this is looking pretty good. I think that's going to create a pretty cool looking result. A lot of this comes to just trying to create as organic and random of a fuel field as you can. And I think this is going to look pretty good. So now let's get to baking the first version of our simulation. Before we do that, I'm going to add some turbulence with our new mixed fuel operator here. So essentially what this new operator does is it's going to feather down your turbulence and create variety in your turbulence over time. Essentially how you want to use this is you want to create the maximum amount of turbulence at the initial part of your blast and then bring it down to 0 whenever your particles are essentially dead. So we have 3 controls here. We have the initial turbulence strength, the ending turbulence strength, and then the turbulence duration, or essentially the number of frames that it's going to take to get from 20 turbulence strength to 0 turbulence strength. So what we want to do is we're going to create those detailed bubbles and energy within the first part of our blast and then bring it down to when everything starts to settle. We might just go to frame 30 here and go through our explosion. So our explosion happens for about, I'd say, 10 frames. So we might just change our turbulence duration to something like 15. And then we'll go ahead and select frame 30. And then if we click this mixed fuel operator, it's going to create turbulence from frame 30 to frame 45 over the course of our explosion, feathering it down over time. And that might increase the initial turbulence strength to something like 25, just to give it a little bit more randomness and a little bit more energy in our blast. And then we'll go ahead and select this. And yeah, that's it. It's going to create some fuel mixer fields that are automatically going to add that turbulence to your scene. Of course, you can adjust these manually as well if you don't like your result, but I think that's going to look pretty good. Before we do our initial simulation, we'll go ahead and add a ground plane to our scene. So we'll go ahead and use the collision cube as our ground plane, just so our smoke interacts with it. And we'll just scale it up and put it right below our truck here. And something like that should be pretty good. Now essentially the reason we added, of course, the collision cube is so that the smoke and particles interact with it in a very organic way. Alright, so let's go ahead and add a light to our scene really quickly. Maybe we'll just do an area light. So just press Shift A and add an area light. We'll just scale it up, and just to create some shading on our smoke before we bake it out, we'll just do a single source like this. And we'll also go ahead and add a sky to our scene. We'll change this to sky texture. And we'll change our light strength value to something like, we'll do 10,000. And we'll just go here to our render properties, and we'll also make our film transparent here. While we're here, we'll go ahead and change the volume step size to 0.05, max steps to 260. We'll change the light paths under the volume setting. We'll change this to something like 5. That's just so our light will bounce around our smoke a bit more. We'll change the render options here to something like 30, and we'll keep it like that for the test renders. Anyway, let's go ahead and select our smoke domain here, and we'll adjust a few of the KHAOS smoke domain settings here before we bake. We'll just go ahead and bring up the resolution divisions to something like 256, just so we have a slightly larger scale looking explosion. And of course you can adjust this as well depending on what you're going for. The higher this is, the larger scale your smoke explosion is going to look. The lower it is, the more small scale it's going to look. So it totally depends on experimentation. If anything, I would start low and then experiment with it, making it bigger and bigger until you get a result that you like. And then of course you can add your high resolution noise, which we will do later in this tutorial. And this is looking pretty good. We're going to keep most of the smoke domain settings here, except for the under the fire tab here. We'll change the reaction speed to something like 0.2, and that's just so it takes a little bit longer for our flames to burn out. Before we bake our initial base mesh, we'll go ahead and save our project. So we'll go to File, Save As. I'll create a new folder for this project. We'll call this Truck Explosion Tutorial. We'll call this Truck Explosion. And save. And now also under our smoke domain physics tab here, we will choose here under the cache tab where we want to save our smoke simulation data. So we'll just go ahead and select this here, and we'll create a new folder under that same folder that we just created, and we'll call this smoke simulation cache. We'll just select that, and now Blender is going to save all of your simulation data within that folder. And yeah, let's go ahead and we'll change the end frame of our simulation to wherever we want Blender to stop simulating our explosion. So for example, since we started our explosion at frame 30, maybe we want to go for around 4 seconds. So we'll go ahead and change this to something like 130. And one more thing before we press that bake button, we'll go ahead and under the dissolve setting here, under our smoke domain settings, we'll go ahead and check this. We'll leave the time for our smoke to fade away to around 200, and that's going to be 200 frames for the smoke to dissipate throughout your scene. And yeah, this should be pretty good. So let's go ahead and save our project one more time just so we don't lose it in case for whatever reason Blender crashes. And we'll go ahead and press bake data, and then give your computer some time to simulate your explosion. Alright guys, so we are back, and this is our initial baked simulation. As you can see, it looks pretty cool here. I think it's doing what we want it to do. So we're going to go ahead and bake this explosion with some high resolution noise added on top of it for that finer detail in our smoke and fire. So before we bake in high resolution, I always like to preview my explosion in real time in preview mode using the OpenGL render active viewport, as I've shown you before if you've seen any of our other videos. So let's go ahead and close this here, and we'll go ahead and just add a camera to our scene here really quick. We'll press Shift A, we'll add a camera, and we'll just put this back here like this, and we'll view through the camera. And something like this should look pretty good. So now we'll go ahead and try that OpenGL render active viewport. So to do that, we'll just go to View, Viewport Render Animation. Actually, before we do that, we want to change the ending frame of our animation to 130 like we had for the bake settings. So we'll go to 130 here, and now we'll try that again. We'll go to the Viewport Render Animation, and now what Blender is going to do is it's going to go through all of your frames in preview mode here, just so you can see how your explosion is looking in real time when we play it back here in a second. Alright, so it's finished rendering in preview mode here. To play back our animation, we'll just go to Render, View Animation, and now as you can see here, we can see our explosion in real time playing back here. And it's looking pretty cool. There are a few things I would change. I might adjust some of the fuel particles so that they blast a little bit more downward so that we can get a little bit more flames around the bottom of the car here. But it's looking pretty cool. So for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to bake that high resolution noise onto this simulation. So we'll just go ahead and close this and reselect our smoke domain here. And as you can see here, if you didn't already know, we have updated the KHAOS add-on with the new KHAOS fire shader, which gives a very easily adjustable fire shading result in a very quick way. And as you can see here, the flames already look pretty awesome, I would say. As you can see, we get some pretty nice detail in the fire already, and this is even without that high resolution noise that we're about to bake on top of it for that extra detail. And of course, you can adjust all of the fire shading settings in the shading tab here. If we just go here and we select the smoke domain again, as you can see, the KHAOS fire shader is ready and available for you, and it's very simple to use, but we'll go over that in a second. Let's get to baking that high resolution noise on top of our original simulation. So we'll go back to layout mode here, and we'll just go back to that physics tab while our smoke domain is selected, and then we'll just scroll down here to noise, and we'll go ahead and open this up. We'll go ahead and check the noise checkbox, and depending on how much high resolution noise you want to bake on top of your simulation or how close your camera is going to be, you might want to increase the up-res factor even more than 2, but I'm going to just use 2 for the sake of this tutorial. But you should know that depending on how close you want your camera or your render to be of your smoke and fire, you may want to increase this up-res factor to 3 or 4. And I think actually for the full rendered animation for this tutorial that you've seen at the beginning of this tutorial, we actually up-resed that explosion by 3, but I think 2 should be pretty detailed as well, considering where we placed our camera. One more time before we press bake noise, we'll just save our project here, and now we'll just go ahead and press bake noise, and then once again give your computer some time to bake that noise on top of the original explosion simulation that we have created. Alright guys, so we are back and we have baked our high resolution noise on top of our original smoke simulation, and it's looking pretty awesome here. You can see that there's a lot more detail in the smoke and fire here, and I think once we go into rendered mode you're going to notice that even more. To finish off this tutorial, I'm going to show how you can shade your smoke or fire a little bit differently, and then we are going to add our glass particles utilizing a glass debris field and an omnidirectional burst here in a very simple way, and then we'll get to rendering our explosion. Alright, so first I'm going to go ahead and select our domain cube, and we'll just go to the shading tab, and now we're going to just essentially adjust the materials to our explosion here. So we'll just go to rendered view here. As you can see, I think we have some pretty nice looking detail in our fire here, and this is essentially our default domain settings here, and I think it's looking pretty good, but of course there are a lot of things you can change depending on what you're going for in your simulation, so just keep that in mind. One thing that I really like to do, depending on the style of explosion you're going for, if you're going for that thick gasoline style explosion look, then what you can do is you can increase the smoke contrast a little bit to cut up the flames a little bit more. So I'll just go ahead and show you an example of that just really quick here. So I'll go ahead and select the smoke contrast here, and we'll go ahead and boost it to something like 10. Since our flames aren't quite as bright now, we can also play around with the flames brightness or flames contrast. I might increase the flames contrast a little bit just to make them cut up the smoke a little bit more. So we'll just go ahead and bring this to something like 10. And now we're getting that kind of thick, fiery look, and I might just boost the density of our smoke a little bit as well. Try something like 260. To give you an extreme example of what that dense smoke looks like, we'll just go ahead and put this at 28. And this is kind of a stylistic result here. You can go to different frames of your simulation to see what it looks like at different times. Another thing that I should mention is some of these bubbles here, you can break that up with some higher turbulence. So whenever we added that turbulence using our turbulence operator, you could just increase that or make it last a little bit longer, and then these bubbles would break up a little bit more. And it totally depends on the kind of simulation you're going for, but there are a lot of different smoke settings you can play with. You can play with the smoke color, the smoke density, smoke contrast, the flames brightness, flames contrast, and of course the color ramp here. But I have the specific example at smoke density at 200, smoke contrast at 4, flames brightness at 6, flames contrast at 4, and then our color ramp is at its default. But of course, if you want to change the color of your smoke, then you could just change this primary color here, or you could just add a bunch of different colors along the color ramp for an even more custom result. Anyway guys, to finish this video, we're going to add that glass debris field. So we're going to go to the layout mode here again, and we'll just go ahead and select our smoke domain, and we're going to go ahead and disable it for this part of the tutorial just so our computer runs a little bit faster. So we'll just go ahead and under our smoke domain settings here, we'll just go ahead and disable the view option. We'll go ahead and go to frame 20 where our explosion starts, and we'll click near the center of our car here. So that's where we're going to add our glass debris, and we'll go to our KHAOS tab, deselect the dynamic smoke fire, and then instead we'll check the glass particles, and we'll leave most of our particle parameters the same, and we'll just go ahead and click on omnidirectional burst, and we'll just place this omnidirectional burst inside of our car here. And since our car is a collision object, all of the glass is going to bounce around inside of the car in a very organic way. So let's go ahead and just play through it really quick to see what we're getting. And as you can see already, we have some cool glass particles coming out here, which you could honestly just leave it like this, but we're going to adjust it a little bit just so you guys know how to do that inside the particle system. But yeah, this could work pretty nicely, I would say. Let's go to the particle tab here and just adjust a few things. We'll go ahead and change the number to something crazy. We'll kind of boost it up just so we can really see them in our render. So we'll go ahead and put it up at around 2000. And let's see what that looks like. And now you can see we're getting some pretty nice looking glass particles blasting out here. Maybe even more. Maybe we even try 2400. And we'll also increase the randomize setting here. We'll go ahead and make this something like 28. That's just going to increase that random velocity to give the glass particles some more variation. And since we're only using one glass particle system instead of adding, like we did for the original explosion, a bunch of different operators to kind of build the blast, we're going to try to make this one a little bit more random. So let's see what that does. That looks pretty cool, kind of blasting out here. The floor of our scene here is also interacting with these particles, so that's pretty cool as well. Alright, so this is looking pretty cool. We might go to render and increase the size of our glass particles a little bit since they're kind of small. So we might increase the scale to something like, we'll try 1, and that's looking cool. Got a little bit more chunks in there, and then we'll increase the scale randomness as well. Maybe we'll try something like 0.6, and then we'll try it again, see what it's doing right now. That's looking pretty cool, but now they're slowing down a little bit, so we need to decrease our drag settings a little bit. So we'll go ahead and we'll go to physics, and we'll just decrease our drag setting a little bit to something like 0.5, and then we'll also decrease our damp settings to 0.02. And these three settings essentially are slowing down the particles as they're blasted out. It's something you can play around with to kind of control the velocity of your particles over time. So when we decrease them, they're not going to slow down as much over time. So let's go ahead and play it back. Might increase the drag a tiny bit, maybe something like 0.8. I'd say that looks pretty cool. And one thing that sometimes happens in the default settings, the rotation can be a little bit high, so we'll go ahead and open up the rotation tab here of our glass particle system, and we'll go to the angular velocity, and we'll bring down this amount to something like 2. And now our particles are acting pretty organically. So yeah, this should be pretty good. Let's go ahead and bake these particles so we don't have to simulate them every time and re-simulate them again and again. So to bake this particle system, we'll go ahead and go under the cache tab here, and we'll just press bake, and now Blender is going to go through and bake out your animation for those glass particles. So now we can kind of see where we are at different times. And yeah, I'd say that looks pretty cool. Let's go ahead and re-enable our smoke and fire here on the smoke domain. Alright, so I started the glass explosion 10 frames early, so that's no problem. What we can do is we'll just disable our fluid again for our smoke domain, reselect the glass particle system. We'll go back to our particle tab here, and we'll go ahead and delete the bake, and we can change the frame start and frame end here. So we'll change the frame end to we'll try 34, and frame start to frame 31. And now our glass debris field will start where we want it to. And I should have just selected the correct frame initially, but I accidentally selected 10 frames back from our original explosion by accident. So anyways, this should work now. So let's go ahead and bake our glass debris field again. And now we'll go back to our smoke domain, re-enable the view option. I'd say we have a pretty nice looking truck explosion here. Got lots of glass particles. Let's go ahead and set up our scene to be rendered, and then I'll give it a test render and finish off this video. Alright, so I'll go to the render tab here, and we'll go ahead and render it at 30 samples. Anywhere between 20 to 60 samples is pretty good for smoke. I usually keep it around 30 just to keep render times down. Yeah, we'll leave it there. Go ahead and keep our film on transparent. If you want to render this ground as a shadows only plane like I did in the video so that you can overlay it on top of something else, you can just go to the object tab here, and under visibility we'll just make it a shadow catcher. So go ahead and select that, and now it's only going to render shadows. And if I do that, I'll normally go ahead and add a material for the ground plane as well that's just a little bit darker, maybe like a middle gray color, just so it's not bouncing so much light into our scene as much. For the scene setup, that's pretty much it. We could add a few more lights, but I think it's looking pretty good. So we'll go to our output tab here. As usual, I'm going to use an OpenEXR file format with an alpha channel. We can choose wherever we want to output our file, so we'll go ahead and do that. We'll just choose that same folder, and we'll call it and accept. And yeah, that's pretty much it. This will output as an OpenEXR sequence, so you can do your compositing either inside of Blender or inside of another third-party compositor of your choice. And yeah, you should have a pretty good result. Let's go ahead and find a cool frame here to render out. If you were going to render out your whole animation, of course, you just go to render animation here. But for the sake of this tutorial, I've already rendered mine out, so I'll just render a quick image, give it a quick critique and composite, and finish up this video. So we'll go ahead and click this, and then give your computer some time to render out your explosion. Alright, so here's our explosion rendered out here. It took about 5 minutes to render everything. And I'd say it's looking pretty good. We got some nice glass debris over here that's bringing everything together, and our fire is looking pretty nice as well, even with just that up-res factor of 2, not even cranking it up to 3 or 4. So I'd say we got a pretty nice looking result. Of course, you could also render your flames and your glass debris on separate channels so that you have more control in whatever compositing program you're going to use. And of course, you're also going to obviously add some glow and glare to your explosion to bring it into whatever environment that you're putting your explosion into. But anyways, guys, I hope you get the general concepts. I hope this video was helpful. As always, feel free to leave any comments if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Be sure to get the latest build of KHAOS. I think you're really going to like the updates, especially the new KHAOS Fire shader. Comment below if you have any recommendations on what kind of videos you'd like to see next, and I'll see you guys next time.